So today you're going to learn about Protist, and Protist is one of the kingdoms that we have left to do. So we've done bacteria, we've done archaebacteria, now we're going to talk about protists. So there are three distinct groups of protists. There are plant-like protists, there are animal-like protists, and there are fungi-like protists, and those are mostly classified as the slime molds. And all protists will share the following features. So most of them will be unicellular, which means they're made up of just one cell. They are eukaryotic, which means that they have a membrane-bound nucleus. And they also mostly reproduce asexually through a process of binary fission, which you've learned about, and certain ones will reproduce asexually through a process called longitudinal fission, and you're going to see what that looks like in a minute. So the first one we're going to talk about are plant-like protists. And why are they considered plant-like? So if I asked you what characterizes a plant, hopefully you would say something that they contain chlorophyll and that allows them to photosynthesize, so they can actually make their own food. They don't need to ingest any food. They're autotrophic, again, which just means that they can make their own food. They don't need to ingest. However, in the darkness, so if there's no light available to them, they can actually become heterotrophic. Okay, so they can actually engulf solid food and allow them to ingest food rather than making it if there is no light available. So the first example that we're going to talk about is the euglena. And that's a picture of the euglena here. And there's lots of different features that the euglena has that we're going to go over now. So some of the characteristics. There is an eye spot. Okay, so the eye spot right here. And what that does is it's used to detect light. So it will be the thing that finds the light in whatever scenario that the euglena is in, and it will find the light so that it can get enough light to make its own food. It has a flagellum, which allows it to move. The flagellum is here. It has a pellicle, and the pellicle is the entire outer coating of the euglena. Okay, and the pellicle, a lot of times in euglena, will be very pliable, which means that they can kind of fit themselves into small areas, and they can move depending on the organelles inside of them that need to move around. So they're usually very flexible. Some euglena have a harder pellicle, but most are fairly soft. They also have vacuoles, and vacuoles help to not only collect but remove excess water. So there's your vacuoles there, and just like the vacuoles in your plant cell and your animal cell, they will take in water, but they will then allow it to expand if they need more water, and they'll contract if they have some excess water. They don't have a cell wall, which makes them a little bit different from regular plant cells, but as I mentioned previously, that's important for them so that they can kind of find themselves and put themselves into tight situations, fit themselves through small holes. They store any excess food as starch, just like a plant cell would do. So as it photosynthesizes, it will make food, it will use what it needs, and then it will store the rest as starch for a lot of plants, and then that way they can access that starch later on whenever they have a need for more food. And the euglena reproduces asexually, which is longitudinal fission, which essentially just means that it will grow itself, it will double everything, and then it will just split down the middle, and you'll have two new euglena through that way. So they don't need any other mate, they just reproduce asexually. So other plant-like protists that we're going to look at, there's three different types of algae. There is red algae, brown algae, and green algae. So first with the red algae is actually multicellular, and if you blow up you'll see kind of usually black dots all through here, and what that is that you'll show the nuclei that are in each cell of the algae. There is no flagella, so they don't move around that way. They're usually aquatic, so you'll find them in the water. They reproduce sexually, okay, so they will need another mate, or if there are certain parts on the algae that they can mate with themselves, they will do that as well. And red algae is very traditional in Asian cuisine, so they use it a lot in their cooking. Brown algae is your typical seaweed, okay, for example, kelp. What they do is they attach to rocks and shells in the water. And another cool feature that they have air bladders. And what air bladders are is they will expand, which will allow the blades of the seaweed to actually float to the surface of the water. So if they fill themselves with air, they will float to the surface of the water. And the reason why it would do that is because it needs to get maximum sunlight in order to photosynthesize. So it's a cool feature of it. A lot of fish have air bladders as well. So if they want to sink down deeper, they will shrink their air bladder, and if they want to float up higher to the surface, they will actually inflate their air bladder. So brown algae has that capability as well. And finally, green algae. Green algae can be unicellular or multicellular. They tend to live in large colonies, so you'll see a lot of them together. There are both salt and freshwater species, so depending on the species that you're looking at, they can live in both environments. The main examples that we're going to look at in our next lab is you're going to be looking at the volvox and the spirogyra, things like that, but you will see those whenever we look at them in the microscope. Some other plant-like protists include diatoms and dinoflagellates. The diatoms are mostly unicellular. They're a very common type of phytoplankton, and if you remember anything about food chains from grade 9, the phytoplankton is one of the lowest things on the food chain, and so they are something that get ingested by a lot of aquatic species. Okay, as it says below, they are producers in the aquatic food chain, so because they make their own food, they're considered producers, and then different levels of the food chain would feed on them. You will often find them in colonies, and they have a cell wall made of silica, and silica is a chemical compound that's found in glass. Okay, so if you look at the picture up above here, you can see how whenever you look at it under a microscope, it actually looks like it has a glass compound to it, and lots of different shapes and colors and sizes. In the dinoflagellates over here on the right, they are unicellular, and they actually have 2 flagella, so that will allow them to actually spin in the water if they kick them both at the same time. Many dinoflagellates are photosynthetic, but some are actually mixotrophic, which means they're a mixture of both photosynthetic, but they can also ingest prey. So again, depending on their circumstance or what they need, they can change. And dinoflagellates are the thing that cause the red tide. So if you look at the picture there, you'll see that the red tide can happen whenever there's an overabundance of dinoflagellates in the water. Happens a lot on coastal cities, and you can see the red water there, and that just means there's an excess amount of dinoflagellates. Some people also call it algal bloom, but that's what causes the red tide. So now animal-like protists. Protozoa, okay, so where we get the word protist means first animals, so that's why they're named that. Animal-like protists, unlike plant-like protists, are actually heterotrophs. Okay, so they need to ingest their food. Most do not ingest it as you would assume most animals or humans do, but what they do is they actually engulf their food, and that process is called phagocytosis. So here's an amoeba engulfing a paramecium. So here is the paramecium, and it is being engulfed into this area here. And what they do is they actually just take their cytoplasm and they wrap it around the food, and they pull it in inside of them, and then they can ingest their food that way. They are eukaryotes. Okay, as we mentioned, all protists will be eukaryotic in that they have a membrane-bound nucleus. And how we actually classify them is by how they move. So in order to make sure we have different groups of protists, animal-like protists, and they'll all be classified based on how they move. So we have flagellates, we have sporozoans, we have sarcodines, and we have ciliates. The sporozoans cannot move on their own, so they have no pseudopods, they have no cilia, and they have no flagella. You'll learn what pseudopods and cilia are in a minute, but they do not have any ability to move on their own. Therefore, they are considered parasites. So they will invade other organisms and move in their blood or body fluids. Okay, so an example of this is the Plasmodium, and the Plasmodium vivax is what causes malaria. And in order to transmit malaria, it needs two hosts. It needs a human, and it also needs a mosquito to transport it. So that's why we buy mosquito nets and bug netting for those countries that suffer from a lot of malaria, is that the mosquitoes themselves are what transports the malaria around. It transports the Plasmodium, which causes malaria in humans. So it requires that vector to carry it. Okay, so there's the mosquito, and when it bites the human, it actually will, because the Plasmodium is found inside the blood, it will then pull in the Plasmodium into it, and when it bites the next human, the Plasmodium will then go into the next human. And so you can see over here on the right, here you can see the Plasmodium inside the cells.